drinking absinthe is so much more akin to drinking wine than it is to drinking a cocktail or a neat spirit. And I always think it sort of has this, it has the mouth feel and texture. It's not the same as wine, but it has as much nuance of mouth feel and texture as wine does. And then it has all the herbaceous element, right? Which is incredibly complex, almost like a really fine tea. So I always like to kind of compare absinthe to a made up combination of tea and wine.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, for another episode of Decoding Cocktails. I am Chris LeBeau, and I just got off the phone with your mother, and she told me how proud she would be of you if you would subscribe to, share, and or rate and review this podcast. Everybody could use a little extra love from their mom, and so there you go. This is the ticket. So beyond that, my guest today is Will Elliott. He is the Vice President of Premier Enterprises, and Premier Enterprises is a hospitality holding company that has several ventures on the East Coast of the U.S. and in the United Kingdom. We came together today to talk about a book that is coming out here shortly on April 25th that Will helped co-author called the Maison Premier Almanac. And this is a book that is a deep study of a bar that he has worked at and helped helm largely since 2011. The concept was baked when Will was brought on, and originally he was just a fellow bartender behind the bar, but went on to become director of that bar program. And so what do you need to know about this bar? Why yet one more cocktail book in the world? So this is a little quote that I hope will help if you're not familiar with the place. Maison Premier should be a New Orleans-inspired place with French styling, American craftsmanship, and influences from history. The story held that Maison opened in the 1800s and stopped modernizing in the 1930s. I'd followed this bar for a while and had the chance to visit last fall, and I did not disappoint. You'll unfortunately hear me fanboy out a little bit during this interview, but what makes this place magical, in my opinion, is that, as you'll hear in this conversation, they really did choose to sweat the small stuff. Thinking about things like attire and the decor on the wall, every little detail was sweated to a point where Maison does kind of overall look and feel like a place that is in the 1930s. And so it is a very transportive environment. And so it was fun for me to I kind of rushed at the end of a New York trip to kind of step into this place. And it was interesting at times where like the photography that comes out of this place is very, very magical. And it was interesting to see the vibe captured so well. I've written a little blog article on this piece, on the place that I visited. And so if you would care to take a look at that, there'll be a link to that in the show notes. Things that we're going to get into in this interview. We're going to talk a little bit about why technique is so important to Will. He is going to break down absinthe for you. You got to hear a bit from him about it at the very beginning right here. But, absinthe for many people is still a relatively unknown spirit. And so Maison has a massive absinthe selection. They also have a huge oyster selection. And so they have really chosen to lean into these items in a very, very deep way. Maison is the kind of place that sweats the small stuff, but as we will also talk about in it, despite the uh, well-clad nature of the place, it is decidedly a place that you go to have fun and escape as opposed to formal on formal, I believe, as I say during the conversation. It it's a really cool book in terms of you buy this is in a way it's a great study in building a brand and a place, but it's also a fun divergence. So you're probably buying this book, admittedly, shout out to Will for all of his beautiful creations. You're buying this book less for the drinks because you're probably not going to make a ton of them because, as Will said, he is very quick with the drinks at Maison to grab another quarter ounce of this or that. So some very complicated builds. But it's fun to watch them break down the style that has ultimately become this place that opened in 2011, still going very strong. It's only 700 square feet inside, and they have this wonderful little garden patio on the back. So it's I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Will. It's a beautiful place. Everybody should have the chance to visit. You can follow Maison Premier online at Maison, Maison Premier. So feel free to go ahead and check that out. You can also follow Will. I'll have a link to his handle. I believe it's Young William Elliott, I believe is his Instagram handle. So with that, I'm out of here. Enjoy this conversation with Will. So, Will, a place I was curious to start is I think it was in the book that before, in the process of when you were recruited to Maison, you were in Tucson and bartending and playing music, but it mentioned you collecting a lot of esoteric liqueurs.
Yeah.
And I was curious, what led you to start that? Or do you remember like a first bottle or taste you had that made you want to pick up such a hobby?
Yeah. My parents were not drinkers. So I did not grow up with alcohol, particularly in the house. And the only exception being that my father in the 80s, sort of fancied himself a little bit of a gourmand, at least to the extent that, he would attempt making like bouillabaisse or, some classic like, festive dish like that. And so the one exception was that there was Pernod in hidden deep within the cupboard, our kitchen. So um, I had that flavor lodged in my mind, and I think I was always I was always like affected by flavor. My father was also like into spices and herbs and seasonings at a time when, again, the 80s, it wasn't really the heyday of good American eating. Um, so yeah, so I was really, I remember even just like chewing like caraway seeds as a kid, or like, so I've always kind of had that little quirk, for whatever that's worth. And I think that once I grew up, I wasn't a casual drinker for like high school and college. I didn't hardly drink at all. So when I did finally drink, it really affected me. And I didn't want to think about drinking like, flavored vodka and things like that. So, I think I had a Amaro pretty early on in my drinking days, which is probably, I'm dating myself now, but probably 2004 or something, around there. And that was my first experience with like an herbal liqueur. I still had yet to experience chartreuse or Genevieve or absinthe or anything, but so I had it was probably just Fernet. It could have been a Verna, and those things were very limited in the early aughts. There was not a lot of it in retail outlets, especially not in Arizona. So, wherever I could get my hands on a bottle of, the more obscure, the better herbal liqueur. That's kind of where that started. I wasn't fascinated by like whiskey, like some people are. I wasn't fascinated by, dirty martinis. I'm not dissing either of those things. It's just my own personal angle really came from this sort of herbal spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had many a moments with spirits, but to things talked about in the book, I've talked about it before on this. But yeah, like I mean, for me, I absolutely remember where I was when I first had my first taste of Amaro. I was in my friend Josh's backyard, and it was just like, "What is this?" Right? Or I remember tasting rum agricole for the first time and being
Yes,
like, "Holy cow, what in the heck
sure.
is this?" And so while I, had my dalliances with excessive drinking, I suppose, in college, I agree that there's certain things that make your, the hair on the back of your neck stand up to be like, what's going on here flavor wise right now?
Exactly. Yes, and that's exactly how it happened to me. I was just once I was bit by the bug, I was bit by the bug.
Hmm, hmm. So obviously with Maison having been around for a while, a number of people have experienced it, but first where to jump in, I remember you saying along the lines in the book that no place has ever made you feel like a bartender quite like this. And
Mhm.
for people that, so tell us a little bit about why that's the case. Tell us what makes this place special.
I think so much of it actually is intrinsic to the space. And not just what you'd think, like the surface finishing textures and colors and artwork and plants, not just that, but I'm more saying the physical design of the bar, the idea of it being a horseshoe bar. You are, depending on how you look at it, you're either trapped back there or you're on stage. Both I think are can be equally valid. And it it's such a prominent visual achievement. Like when you walk into Maison Premiere, you're just instantly confronted with a dapper bartender, behind this memorably circular bar. And there was something about Maison at the time, especially when we were brand new to the world of, to the cocktail environment, cocktail community. Um, we really experienced like a lot of um, people coming out, a lot of celebrities, a lot of industry titans, and so it was just a really crazy place to be in 2011, 2012, 2013.
I you know, I'd followed you guys for a while, like probably a number of people, but when I walk in, yeah, it was just the place is just so distinctly itself. I liked this line in terms of it says the painting inside was done by an expert in historical recreation who distressed the walls up to 20 layers of various waxes to accrete a century of imagined history. He patiently watched the path of the sunlight across the interior and bleached the walls accordingly. And I think it's a lovely sentiment for the fact that I remember sitting there and knowing that I was in the year 2022, and yet there really are these aspects. The music, everything has obviously been fussed over. A beautiful point of the almanac. I love the fact that you actually have a chapter on dress. It's like
Sure.
these are the things that make a place so distinctly itself. And I know that was also part of what you guys hit upon is that when you opened, there were great cocktails in New York City,
Yep.
but the cocktails in a way were more front and center as opposed to the space being just so transporting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're totally right. I think we kind of self-identify as being the latter half of the cocktail renaissance, if you will. So we have to acknowledge our sort of forerunners in that case. And we, to this day, I have a lot of respect for all those bars. But I think there was a really conscious effort on Josh and Christoph's part. And Josh and Christoph, of course, are co-founders. I was like essentially a first hire, but they had the vision fully intact when I walked into the space, and the space wasn't even open yet for another 2 or 3 months. So I was here I had moved to the city. I guess it was about 6 weeks, 6 weeks to 8 weeks before opening. And so I was in the space, seeing the build out and trying to wrap my head around the proportions of the place, the size of the bar seemed really small to me. Um, and to their credit, if you had asked me pre-opening what the functionality of it would be, I was a little worried. And, just from a purely operations standpoint, how we were going to pull off, top tier craft cocktails at a reasonable speed behind that bar. And I was so wrong. It's absolutely a design that even in our other projects, we keep revisiting as being just almost a superior design, I think, for a bar. And it makes sense spatially, if you just think about a circle, you have so much stuff at your reach because of the curvature, rather than needing to walk 5 to 10 to 20 feet down a straight shot bar. I loved Sauvage. I thought Sauvage was a beautiful space. Again, another Josh designed project. And yet, nothing replaces Maison's bar for me for functionality, speed, aesthetic, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So to that point, to a term that people who are in the industry and listen, probably are all familiar with the term mise en place, and yet I
Yeah.
like that at Maison we have this whole other term and approach of do easy. So tell the folks at home what in the hell do easy is, and not too long of a drive for me is William S. Burroughs's grave. So yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. So it was a video that I stumbled upon years ago. And to me, it's a Gus Van Sant short. And it's rather obscure in its style of teaching or whatever you want to call it. But it's essentially an instructional video about just how to do everyday motions, the things that you do most in your life, sometimes plague us or haunt us as being the hardest. And the idea of do easy is that, since it's something you're doing every day, you should really put thought and effort even into the mundane things that you do every day. Probably, arguably, even more effort and thought than, the things you do once a year. So it's all these little motions that you do every day, sort of explained and analyzed in a video. Things like picking up a piece of paper off the ground and throwing into the garbage, or lifting up I think he lifts up like an amplifier or a speaker unit or something. So applied to bartending, I'm a technique driven person by nature. I grew up playing baseball, I grew up skiing, and I obsessed about form in those things. And so I just always think there is a perfect way to bartend, at least for Maison Premier. And and I wanted to define that, And so rather than getting bound up in various notable bartenders' opinions and styles and sort of emulating and picking from them, I actually really wanted to try to create our own style. Now, granted, of course, shaking a drink is shaking a drink, and people have done it before, but how does Maison shake a drink? I could have very easily just plugged in. I was obsessed with the Japanese hard shake, as I think a lot of people were from those early YouTube videos when there was only a couple of YouTube videos on what that is and what it looks like. I could have easily just plugged that in and insisted that our staff or we all learn the Japanese hard shake. Instead, I wanted to make a uniquely Maison thing. So we developed something called the sort of American hard shake, as I call it, which isn't rhythmic for a number of reasons. It was almost too performative. I didn't necessarily think that it always was the right way to shake every single drink. So we sort of adapted with the form and played with the form, and landed on a very different style shake that I think is notable. Like when you walk into Maison, it has a very iconic sound. And we can get into that if you'd like, but it's because of the style of shaker combined with the method of shaking, and the way we pack it with ice and such.
Yeah, I do in a minute want to get into that. But another thing that I remember reading, because you talk about, hey, that efficiency is clearly important.
Mhm.
And with you guys, as you said, a patio is apparently going in right now, more seats to have to fulfill. But so is this idea of fluidity and grace. And I feel like one of the things that was interesting, I remember noting when I was there that you address in the book is this idea that uh double jiggering is something. So for the people listening at home that don't know it, it's like, okay, we have two jiggers, one large, one small that they're holding at the same time. And this is something that is, it's not common practice. And
Mhm.
how much more efficient it's going to make you is a question, but really more this idea that it's a little bit of flair you can inject into the process without totally slowing your team down at the same time.
100%. Yeah, and I do like to give credit where it's due in moments like this. I think it was called functional flair is a Toby Maloneyism. Toby Maloney, of course, hailing from the Violet Hour in Chicago, worked at Milk and Honey, opened pouring ribbons, and just a hell of a gentleman, and a real disciple of, he practices what he preaches. He's a working bartender. He's behind the bar. I'm not saying every day to this day, but he still gets behind a bar and makes drinks. And he was a firm believer in this sort of, it's a lot of the same stuff that I'm saying about do easy and such. I just needed to put my own language on it and my own spin on it. But he was a firm believer and teacher of, um, the right methodology will breed grace, speed, and good tasting drinks. So yeah, double jiggering specifically, is there a reason to do it at home? I don't know. I mean, it's fun to try for sure. For me, it became, deeply ingrained in just the way we touch and handle everything. So when I'm training bartenders, I always, obviously we're on a podcast, so there's no visual here, but my hands, I'm sticking them out in front of me and they're both upturned. And everything that we do behind that bar is done like this. So when we don't, when we grab a bottle, for instance, the typical motion is to, wrap your fist around it and pull it up by the neck and tilt up your elbow and pour down. And that's not at all what we do. I'm taking a empty kombucha bottle now and demonstrating everything is this sweeping flow of motion, whether it be dashing bitters or picking up cheater bottles, and then even double jiggering. Similarly, there's, believe it or not, there's many ways to double jigger. I believe I have the right superior way, and it's with hands up, palms facing up like this, with two jiggers tucked in between your fingers. Yeah, you can flip them easily. Uh, you know, do they make graduated jiggers now that have quarter ounces that you could, get away with just using one jigger? Yes, you do, and it's not as fun to watch.
And sometimes it's those little dalliances that make it all worth the while right there.
Yeah.
It didn't obviously take too long for you guys to become very well renowned for your cocktail program. And what I liked is despite many of the you know, the garden drinks and the julep drinks that are just so magnificent to behold. Like I remember it's like, I mean, uh I remember I got the cocktail book from the office out of Chicago of the aviary group.
Sure. Like,
And
yeah.
and those guys along with like your Instagram, I'm like, well, I mean, to invoke the term, I'm like, if there is such thing as cocktail porn, here it is right here. But uh
Honored. Thank
it,
you. Very flattering.
but I remember you saying at the same time, knowing that Maison takes its influence from New Orleans and from Paris. I was I don't know if I was surprised. It was more intrigued and wanted to talk about the fact that you said that the cocktail a la Louisiane
Mhm.
is really a litmus test for if your bartenders are dialed in and like a drink that you hang your hat on. Tell us about that drink and what makes it so iconically Maison.
Sure. Yeah, well, if you recall earlier in our talk, I am not the biggest American whiskey fanatic. And I guess, a lot of that's just because I think there's so many things out there that deserve attention. American whiskey's gotten plenty of attention. And to be honest, a lot of the times I don't really feel like it gives me a strong sense of place and location and terroir, if you will. But um, yeah, so that cocktail was like I think one of the first whiskey cocktails that I really fell for and enjoyed personally. Making well-made Manhattans and old fashions was a litmus test in the early cocktail renaissance. And they just kind of left me flat a little bit. I wasn't I was just rather indifferent to it. It was like, okay, I mean, if this is a good old fashioned, I believe you. Good for you. Now my attitude and thinking has evolved over the years, where I see the old fashioned actually as a great litmus test for spirits, and to test a spirit through the vector of making an old fashioned out of it. Um, that being said, the La Louisiane has absinthe, Peychaud bitters, Benedictine, sweet vermouth, and rye whiskey. The first two things are so undeniably New Orleans, of course. So, and the drink has enough complexity that you can mess it up. Things can go out of focus. So it's not like a 2 or 3 ingredient drink like a Manhattan. It's a little bit more complex. So when having a bartender make it and tasting it and evaluating their skills through that, I think you're looking for, obviously, balance goes without saying. And balance is coming from the recipe that we've tweaked and altered and edited over the years. But it's also coming from correctly diluting and chilling. So, you know, correctly diluting and chilling to me are things that are connected at the hip. So you can't just it's not they have to both be true. And a lot of people, especially I think people making drinks at home, the tendency is to understir. Um, and it's not just about stirring long enough, it's about stirring fast enough. And I think that's something that doesn't get mentioned a lot. It's like, okay, I can stir for 2 minutes and get it there, but that's so long that it's going to be overly dilute. You know, if you stir faster with more rotations per second, and let's just say the magic number was 90 rotations, right? Just throwing a number out there. If you get to that 90 rotation mark in 60 seconds, you have a cold and perfectly diluted drink. If you get to that 90 in 2 minutes, then you have taken it too far and it's probably watery and sloppy and lost focus. So I really see it as sort of like aperture on a lens, to help get clarity and focus from those two variables.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, one, I forget where else I've read it too, but obviously watching a lot of amateurs for the first time or people at home, like they also sometimes don't use enough ice, period. But so with that, if we're talking about not stirring fast enough, seems like a perfect time to go ahead and jump in. Like tell us a little bit about what makes the Maison shaking and ice builds um so uniquely themselves too.
Yeah. I mean, so it really comes back to sort of like form um, coming out of function. So, a lot of these things are sort of maybe not the right way to do them in just any bar, but they're the right way to do them at Maison Premier. So some of that's because of the space, the tightness of the space, like the fact that we use cobbler shakers is aesthetic, yes. It is technique, yes, but it's also a much smaller shaking footprint, if you will. When you're behind a tiny, tiny bar, the motion of a cobbler shaker is a lot smaller than the motion of, shaking the shit out of something. So in a two-piece Boston set. So I think that's one perfect example of like why cobbler shakers. It's not just because I'm obsessed with cobbler shakers, which I am, but it actually works with the space itself really well. Now, we use different shakers for different things. Anything with egg white or mint or any sort of really viscous syrup like orgeat or something like that, or anything with cream. We use two-piece Boston style shakers. To make an amazing gimlet or amazing daiquiri or amazing last word, we would be using a cobbler shaker. And when filled all the way with cold draft cubes, there's an almost elliptical whipping motion of, and if you notice, again, this is visual thing that I'm doing, but it's almost the motion of flicking a Frisbee. It's almost the backhand of a racket sport. And it's led with, depending on whether or not you're right or left-handed, it's led and supported with your other arm, which is sort of assisting and guiding. So you're almost like knocking all of this ice. You're kind of chipping it. If you picture the cobbler shaker style, it's actually tapered, the kinds that we use. And so it knocks against that far wall of the cobbler shaker. And it has a really specific sound when done correctly. And you might ask, like, well, what's correct about it, or what makes it correct? Well, you want control over the ice in the shaker. You don't want these ice cubes to be exploding into each other. You want them to almost be moving as one unit, even though there might be 12 individual cold draft cubes, as one movement or one unit slamming into the end or the tip of the cobbler shaker. And that's that really particular click almost that you hear when a Maison bartender is shaking it and doing it right.
Mm-hmm. And there is some nice graphics in the book that kind of illustrate this right here. So quickly, because I do want to talk about the daiquiri in particular in a second, but I will say kind of just, for people out there listening, a lot of them are probably fans of the cocktail world, obviously. Probably didn't go listen for a podcast on drag racing, and here they are. But but what I liked about the book in general was the insanely wide and weird passes that it took on things. I mean, there is, oysters are so, fundamental to who you guys are. There's a whole section on like the parts of the oyster, the types of the oyster. Absinthe is so essential to who you are. Like, like this whole thing breaking down the history of absinthe, the plants at Maison. So what I liked about the book was clearly there's a lot of great recipes, but the story that kind of attempts to capture what is this very unique ethos you've built makes it a very unique book compared to many of the ones that I've read. And so anyway, so that's just a plug to people.
It's very exciting, by the way, to hear you. You're probably the first person that I've talked to that's actually, seen and skimmed or read the book, which spent any time in the book. So it's actually very exciting to hear people's, your response and your, what you made of it. So thank you for reading it.
You're very welcome. It's and so I can't wait to get my actual copy, but the digital copy did it very good justice. So also again, as somebody who is still honing his own craft, even though I teach others the basics, you talked about that when you guys are making a daiquiri at Maison, that you prefer to not fine strain it. So, Will, to somebody like myself who's still at times dialing in his palate and understanding the minor differences, talk to us about the difference of a finely strained versus not cocktail and why you feel that way about the daiquiri.
Yeah, well, The old saying, and it's never been more true than at Maison Premier, the devil is in the details. And that's, you know, and again, tying into what I previously said, that's like there's the right way to do things at Maison is not necessarily the right way to do things everywhere. It's not, I wouldn't apply this ethos, there were a lot of very cognizant differentiations that I tried to pull off at Sauvage on a drink level. Um, Drinks at Maison are incredibly complex in, like, I will go to no end of grabbing another bottle for a quarter ounce of something. And so, some of these specs are 10 to 12 bottle pickups, incredibly complicated garnish it is complicated garnish, I would say is accurate. And whereas at Sauvage, it was a lot more about letting the producer shine through. So I know I'm giving you a really long-winded discussion on my thought process behind this, but I think a lot of it is thinking about what the daiquiri, for instance, what that's supposed to taste like at Maison Premier. And for me, there's a lot of refinement in our drinks, and there needed to be something really almost rustic about the daiquiri, kind of brash and bold. And I carry that, on a flavor level. I really try to amp flavor at Maison, another differentiation from Sauvage, where I would let drinks sort of be themselves more and not manipulate them as much. And, and then, like, for instance, at Sauvage, you'd really just showcase the spirit by itself instead of putting a couple of drops of orange flower water and a couple of dashes of orange bitters and like doing all these tricky little flavor moves. So yeah, at Maison, I really wanted the daiquiri to be a prominent drink. I think I developed the recipe for that in 2013, maybe. I don't know, somewhere around there. Pretty early days, Maison. And, daiquiris were just starting to become, sort of the bartender handshake that they've become today. I feel like, it was, I don't know who first said snackery, actually, but I feel like it was a close friend of ours. And I feel like, those were the terms and the lingo coming out of that era. And so daiquiris all of a sudden had cred, bartender cred. And so I worked very hard on the recipe because I wanted to have the very most impressive, daiquiri spec out there. So the Maison daiquiri, even though it's never been on a menu physically, it's a split base of two kinds of rum, a full ounce of lime juice, and then a half ounce of 2-to-1, which gives it kind of this compression where you're squeezing the sugar with less volume because it's a 2-to-1, but maximizing the citrus to a full ounce rather than a typical 3/4. So anyway, all that coming together, when you taste, it's a very intense daiquiri because there's a split between agricole and Venezuelan rum. And the agricole is overproof. It's very sharp, very vegetal. The full ounce of lime, very acid forward. But then that 2-to-1 half ounce gives it a lot of body, a lot of structure and sweetness. So when you put all that together, I wanted to kind of bust it up a little bit. It was a little too perfect and clean if it was not fine strained, or sorry, if it was fine strained. So fine straining became not what we do to the daiquiri because of that. Now, there's lots of reasons to fine strain other drinks. And in fact, the daiquiri is kind of like the one notable exception that we don't fine strain. A little tip for home bartenders out there. If you make a Collins drink of any sort, and I really just mean, anything going tall into a Collins glass on ice, if you shake whatever the ingredients are, let's say it's a Tom Collins, and then fine strain over the ice and pour soda through the fine strain that you strained out, you will get incredible texture and froth on the top that you would not otherwise get if you just dumped soda or tonic on top of the mixture without pouring it through the fine strain, if that makes sense. So they're just like, there are little things like that really do change the way you experience the drink fundamentally. And yeah, and those are kind of the nerdy things, little tips that I've gathered over the years and that I think define my style. These aren't big realizations or big wins. These are a million little details like that end up making, I think, just better drinks.
Mm-hmm. I have never heard that one before. I'm going to try that. Okay, interesting. And I'm gonna make two because I gotta actually
Well,
you gotta make sure. Yeah. So
I got another one for you. Once you master the fine straining, when to fine strain, when not to fine strain, there's another cool technique in there that I've never seen done before we started doing it, but it's double fine straining while splitting the pour. So with a Hawthorne strainer, you can push down on the gate to split the pour of liquid. So let's say we're making 2 cocktails. That's a perfect way to not have to, fill the cocktail glasses one at a time, but rather simultaneously. And if you can visualize this, you can take 2 fine strainers, cross them like this, hold them with one hand, and then split pour into 2 glasses.
The split pour reference made a lot of sense to me in terms of I've thought about it before when I'm pouring out a cocktail, being like, is this distributed evenly? But
Right.
if I and again I read pretty much all the book, but anyways, that's double fine straining, a split pour. Okay, that is
Yeah, call me.
technique.
Have me on speed dial if you need any
That
assistance.
that's perfect. I love it. I love that so much. So another thing that's so essential to Maison's service that for people who, of course, are not strangers to the bar,
Mhm.
they've probably begun to indulge themselves in this. But I feel like for a lot of people still outside of a Sazerac, um, that absinthe is still, even if they don't think it's going to make them hallucinate, they haven't really dabbled. So um, New Orleans with its French, background. It was very big there. The old Absinthe House, got to frequent it last year at Tales from the
Nice.
Cocktail, and obviously Paris being the other big calling. So, Will, tell us a little bit about absinthe, in whatever way you want. By the
Mhm.
way, it won't make you hallucinate, people. It might make you feel a little glowy, but it's not going to make you hallucinate. But tell us a little bit about it, and you go into this in the book, but where people should think about starting with trying it, even if they're at a bar.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. So just for the record, absinthe was already baked into the idea of Maison Premier by the time I got here. I think we covered that in the book. Josh and Christoph were inspired very specifically by a couple of very influential trips they took to New Orleans and then subsequently to Paris. And so when I got to Maison, I already, it was a month or two before opening, but I already knew the absinthe was going to be a big part of the show. I think most people, especially at that time, didn't know that much about absinthe because there wasn't that much on the market. And it had only been re-legalized in the US in 2008. So a dear friend of ours named Ted Bro, who makes Jade Nouvelle and the Jade Nouvelle line of absinthes, he helped lobby and speak to Congress and re-legalize absinthe. And so we knew it was going to be a big part of our identity. However, we also were keenly aware that it wasn't for everyone and that we couldn't just be a niche bar, that we needed to have more tricks than just absinthe and a beautiful absinthe fountain. I started to taste through and understand and learn absinthe and the history of absinthe. I really crammed for the first few years because there's a lot to sort of catch up on. What's so funny to me is that what you said and how you started this question was about, a lot of people think it's hallucinogenic. I loved your term glowy because I think that's very applicable. But yeah, it's not hallucinogenic. And what's crazy about it is that nowadays it has this horrible sort of, light it on fire, party vibes, college, bad memories, bad hangovers, reputation. Whereas it was really founded as being a healthful, end quotes, heavy air quotes, a healthful liqueur. I said liqueur. It's not technically a liqueur. Liqueurs have added sugar. Absinthe must never have added sugar. So forgive my misinterpretation of it. But absinthe is very similar to pastis. I think a lot of people, that's an easier way to understand it. Pastis was really created after absinthe became banned. Absinthe became banned during Prohibition in the States, and it was the one thing that really never got re-legalized, for a bunch of reasons. But it's between 60 and 70% alcohol. It's very strong, but historically and contextually, you would always dilute it. And so a big part of the downfall in the court of public opinion of absinthe is that people just slowly lessened and lessened and lessened the amount of water they were adding to it. So historically, I always love to tell guests this. Historically, we have a bottle of Pernod absinthe. That was a very kind gift from Daniel Boulud. Actually, he brought it to our restaurant one day, and it's from early 1890s. Incredible gift to and incredible thing to see in front of you. On the back of the bottle, on the label, it says dilute with 5 parts water to 1 part absinthe, which is a very standard serving style that we use to this day. Now, if you do the math on 60% alcohol between, usually around 60 to 70% alcohol, divided by 5, you're looking at what? About 12, 13?
12%.
So you're looking at a percentage of 12 or 13%, which reminds you of what? Wine. Exactly. So drinking absinthe is so much more akin to drinking wine than it is to drinking a cocktail or a neat spirit. And I always think it sort of has this, it has the mouth feel and texture. It's not the same as wine, but it has as much nuance of mouth feel and texture as wine does. And then it has all the herbaceous element, right? Which is incredibly complex, almost like a really fine tea. So I always like to kind of compare absinthe to a made up combination of tea and wine.
I found it useful to kind of talk for that kind of in-depth explanation in the book. And it has not always been a flavor that's spoken to me, and yet it's because for a long time it was never served properly to me. And I even remember distinctly last year, and hey, doesn't mean you're always hiring as a brand the right reps, but there was an absinthe brand at Tails of all places, and they were just pouring it straight into the glass and like, here you go. And I'm just like, I mean, I was like, how do people drink this? Oh, it's because it should be a 4 or 5 to 1 piece, and I think in terms of also what Maison tries to capture, there was a lovely passage in the book, and it might have been from historical, but basically like it takes a while for the water to drip into absinthe, so it's a time intensive process, and that's okay. I like this idea of, I feel like without hopefully feeling like I'm pandering too much. It's like, I feel like when you step into Maison, it feels very like everything has slowed down because we've stepped back in time. And so, hey, if it's going to take a couple of minutes for your drinks to be ready, that's fine. I'm hanging out in 1923 anyways. It's fine. So
absolutely. It's so funny that you say everything slows, and I think the talent that specifically Josh had in building and sort of set dressing the Maison Premier space, the talent that he has in that is that everything is so hyper intentional, and yet it feels absolutely, almost by accident, or just like it's always been there. It never feels overly orchestrated. I think it doesn't, I think that's what separates it. Early on people said Maison feels Disney. You know, I don't think there I don't think there's Maison still just makes excellent cocktails, serves excellent oysters. There's a reality, a throbbing reality to the fact that it is 2023 and you are in Williamsburg and you are in Brooklyn, which is the city of craft, and the brand Brooklyn has gone around the world in that way. And so yeah, I mean, I guess if Maison's Disney, all of Brooklyn's Disney, I guess. Um, yeah, I think, even the fan is intentionally never ever set to the number 2 setting or the number 3 setting. It's on the number 1 setting, and it always will be, because it needs to have that languid motion that reminds you that you're, somewhere else.
Yeah, and the stark contrast to that, like, I think for people that haven't visited, the drinks are beautiful, the staff is clad, and yet, you know, a lot of times the outfits, they feel when I was there in September, the outfits were, people were dressed up, but it was also very relaxed. You had this very inviting jazz music playing, so it was dressy but not stuffy. And so I think that kind of offers this nice contrast of like, we're dressed up for the occasion, but we're also here for a good time, which I think is this lovely balance as opposed to formal on formal.
Yeah, and especially behind the bar, and this was, again, a very intentional thing that was decided early on. But behind the bar, if you notice, there aren't real uniforms. They're not actually uniforms. They're individual people's choices. And now the floor, a back waiter, a bar back, a porter, a shucker, they have uniforms. But the story of Maison in many ways is the bar and the horseshoe bar and the bartenders behind the horseshoe bar. And so rather than, dictating precisely what bartenders wear, it's more of this idea of guardrails, and giving them a frame of how to think about dressing for their job.
Mhm.
So it's a suggestion, in a certain sense. And it enables that kind of personal style to come out, which also plays, I think, into the very Brooklyn thing that we're going for.
Mhm, mhm. But I do think it was cool in terms of like, I remember particularly in this section on attire, it was like, okay, suspenders are in here, but they are attached via buttons, not via clips. And I think it's this idea of like, hey, if you're going to capture the moment, here's what that means. Now, what your suspenders do or don't look like, that's up to you. But to your point,
Yeah.
it's like, but this is what the Maison standard is on.
Yeah. Well, it's like, it's not, we don't have clip-on bow ties, they're real bow ties. And if you're a back waiter and you've never tied a bow tie, guess what? Part of your first couple of days on the job is probably learning how to tie a bow tie. So, I mean, uh, that and a million other details like that, I believe, or I would argue, is what prevents Maison from being Disney or, cliche, or just a replica, a shitty replica of something. It's real, it's breathing, it is alive, it is 2023.
Yeah, I think the depth of the book and these points are what echo when I talked with Steve Grass, who helped bring
Yeah.
Hendrix. He's like dig into Hendrix and you will see that the backstory goes forever. And he goes like, that's what makes a great brand, is like, I think is his point. He said Hendrix will always out weird you no matter the caliber of your gin. The story just goes for forever. And clearly at Maison, to that point, which is beautiful now. I'm sure it was a pain in the ass to work out all the details, but it's like, but that is what makes it so itself in that way.
Yes, and I love the Steve Grass, because he wrote a book on this, I believe. I haven't read it yet, but I'd like to. Yeah, I mean, it is an exhaustive mentality to have. What makes Maison tick every day is exhausting, in the sense of, I mean, for crying out loud, there's a section on plants in the book, like who manages that?
Right.
We do.
Yes.
Like who manages 400, 500 different kinds of liquors? I do. Who manages the 200 bottle wine list? Christoph does, so it's like, it's just never ending. And I think it's a reflection, a very like aspirational reflection of who we want to be. It's I bringing it back to cocktails. It I was getting started as a bartender at a time when history was incredibly important, knowing and understanding, drinking history, drinking culture, because it had been buried in muck for half a century, post prohibition. So, the cocktail renaissance of the 2000s, it was really stressed knowing your history. What's the origin story of that drink, which for me, I realized that I really wanted to obsess more over technique. There were so many friends and peers of mine obsessing over history that it was like, okay, like history, it's important to know, but it's also written by drunks. Like it's inaccurate by nature, So I wanted something that was really real and tangible in my approach to bartending. And so again, I think I'm trying to tease out this like almost manicness that is Maison, that is like plants and artwork and 200-year-old wooden floorboards from a ship. Like all these things come from a mindset of like obsession of detail, obsession of craft, and obsession to never kind of let it rest.
Mhm.
Always keep churning and squeezing and getting, driving it.
Yeah, and I think the book does a good job too of talking about like who was the driving force behind various aspects, like whether it was Christoph or Josh. Like, I mean, that insane level of commitment to oysters, like it's cool now, but I'm sure there were many moments in the time when it's like you got to be driven to like call a bunch of small town oyster farmers and them to be like, what? Like, no, call my distributor. Leave me alone. Like yeah.
100%. And in the early days of Maison, all of that late leg work and framework was happening, while I was purely, involved as a bartender. I wasn't a bar director. I wasn't the managing partner. Like I was a bartender, and I focused with every bit of ferocity, on my craft for that length of time. As I think Christoph was focusing on oysters and learning how to put together a great wine list, and Josh was, when we opened the garden, wasn't even there. So that was year 2 or 3, and Josh built that, so he was wrapping his head around how to be good at that, and so we were all kind of like in our own lanes. And the net results, 12 years later, is the book, I guess, kind of.
Hmm. Yeah, and because the garden is very, again, transporting, and yet to read, oh yeah, this used to be like a shitty lot filled with trash, is like, oh yeah, that takes like this isn't Goldman Sachs money right here. This is like people are trying to figure out how to make that happen right there. So
100%. Yeah, vision and a lot of efforting.
so as we like draw things to a close real quick, I was curious, as somebody like myself, and knowing that absinthe has a spectrum on it, but
Sure.
one of the lines again in the book that kind of just leads me to wonder, like, how do people like myself begin to feel more, I'm always interested for the home bartender, like, how do you feel comfortable flexing outside of the recipe on the page right there, and so if you've got a sour or an old fashioned template, how do you put your little spin on it? And one of the things that you've talked about with a line here was we've seen a simple absinthe rinse lift an otherwise banal cocktail to sublime. Absinthe it's big, it's unruly, as Toby would call it in his book. It's a bully. Are there, in terms of if somebody wanted to begin playing with, absinthe rinses and whatever, are there general formats that if you were them, maybe any kind of like signposts that they might look for in terms of where to deploy it or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I guess when I construct absinthe cocktails, I sort of think about it. I've never even put words on this, so pardon me if I stumble. But I guess I think of it sort of in various levels of involvement on absinthe's part. So there is the simple dash or the simple rinse, right? Which I feel like is almost like you almost don't want to really perceive it as being absent on the palate. Like it's almost so minimal. It's like kind of like, of course, people do this now with saline solution in drinks. Maybe there's some adventurous home bartenders out there who are, doing a couple of drops of saline or a pinch of salt in a drink. And it's kind of like nudging until you start to perceive it as salty or as absinthe and then pulling back just enough. So that's level one. Level two, now we're talking quarter ounce in something, which for me, like Corpse Survivor #2, perfect example, where, at Maison, there are a lot of drinks out there that call for a rinse or a dash or something of absinthe. At Maison, since we are an absinthe bar, I like to amp up a lot of those drinks to like a full quarter ounce or a teaspoon or something. So, the Corpse Survivor #2, when made at Maison, has a full quarter ounce of absinthe, and it shows. Next, I guess, would be like the sort of really seeing absinthe as a base spirit. So we're talking like 3/4 ounce or more. And then you're really looking at like, okay, how do I cram fat, whether literally or figuratively? So I guess by fat, I mean, it could be literal fat coming from milk or cream or egg, but it could also, I'm also referring to texture and mouthfeel. So I'm referring to sugar content. So the thing about absinthe is it suggests a sweetness, but there's no sugar added to real absinthe. And so, it can be a very cruel spirit to work with on the palate because it is so incredibly high in alcohol. And it can be so piercing. And that's the kind of absinthe experience, I think, with cocktails that a lot of people have an unfavorable experience with. But a lot of it, is getting it to a point. If you are going to lean in so hard and use it as a base spirit, make sure you're thinking about dilution and that whole idea of 5-to-1 or 4-to-1. So, you could make one of my favorite ways to drink absinthe of all time, and it's so easy to do at home, is just as an absinthe frappe or frappe. So to those who don't know, it's just adding a little bit of sugar, or you could use a cool liqueur. I love to use like maybe a little creme de cassis or, creme de menthe or whatever, and using that instead of sugar. But anyway, absinthe frappe is just shaking on crushed ice, or you could even just shake it on a big old cube until it disintegrates in the tin. And it's a delicious, delicious drink. And you'll get the dilution that it needs. So,
Perfect. Yeah, no, and the frappe is super simple build. And yeah, a way to kind of like, to the whole point of this, is if you're kind of just wading in right now, try it in a very refreshing, easy way, as opposed to tiptoe your way into the pool. Don't jump in with absinthe. You'll probably jump back out. So
exactly.
Will, we will of course link to the book and to Maison, but where do people keep up with you? Where do they follow along with your little adventure?
Yeah, so the Maison Premier Almanac comes out on the 25th. We will be announcing a lot of events in the upcoming month, as you can imagine. both in New York, but also on the road. We'll be doing a small book tour on the West Coast, I believe, or second week of May on the West Coast. So, San Francisco, LA, probably a few stops in between. And then, the release party at Maison, there will be several of them, and they will be epic. And I can't wait to share the book with more people. It's actually very enjoyable to talk about the book with somebody. So, Instagram, Maison and Instagram is a great way to keep up with new news as it comes. Our website, obviously.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thanks so much for taking the time today. The book's wonderful. So thanks for putting in the effort to make it happen.
We're so excited to share it with everyone. Yeah, great to chat, Chris.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are two great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter, or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.